Today we'll be talking about ancient Greece, sculptural styles, and fancy baths. And specifically, we'll be talking about sculptural styles regarding the human figure, specifically that of the artist Lysippus and his scraper, also known as Apoxyomenos. But before we can analyze this piece, however, let's look at some background information. Ancient Greece was one of the first ancient worlds where we see art, and particularly art regarding depictions of the human figure, really start to become more realistic and refined looking. In ancient Greece, we also start to see the cultural idea and goal to develop both one's mind and one's body. And so during this time period, we start to see some great thinkers and philosophers and schools emerge for the purpose of developing the mind, as well as things like gymnasiums and sporting events to focus on the development of the body. So in these images here, we have some ancient Greek depictions of someone reading a scroll, playing music to represent the development of the mind, and then we have depictions of people running a race to represent the development of the body. Now in Greece, we see three main periods of style and development: archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. And today, we will be taking a closer look at classical ancient Greek art. So Greek classical art spanned from about 480 to 323 BCE. During this time, we see a lot of growth as far as the development and the depiction of the human figure goes. So what is perhaps one of the most iconic pieces of classical Greek sculpture is what we see here. This piece is called Doryphorus, or Spear Bearer, and was created by an artist called Polykleitos in the 5th century BCE. So here we're seeing a Roman marble copy of the piece, as the Greek bronze original no longer survives. It looks virtually the same as the original, with the exception of the support pieces, such as the tree trunk shape we see here and the arm support here. The original bronze sculpture would not have included these supports because the tensile strength of bronze allows the sculpture to hold itself up without the assistance of support pieces. In this piece, as well as many other classical sculptures, we see the figure in a contrapposto stance. So contrapposto meaning that there's one engaged leg, one relaxed leg, and one engaged arm, one relaxed arm. We're also seeing an athlete, specifically a spear thrower, spear bearer. As mentioned before, the Greeks put a huge emphasis on physical fitness and development of the body. Athletes were good for artists to look at so that they could capture these almost perfect muscle shapes in their pieces and even idealize them in some cases. So like in this case, we see some idealized musculature and body shapes in Doryphorus here. So they looked at athletes so that they could capture some of these muscle shapes and study them, while also glorifying the cultural love of physical fitness. People and viewers loved to see these sculptures of athletes. So the Greeks had this big focus on figuring out what proportions were mathematically correct and precise and what they considered in their eyes to be perfect. This piece is where we can see the canon of ideal proportions starting to be born. So in this image here, we can see Polykleitos's proportional choices mapped out more clearly. We see that Doryphorus here is about 7 heads high. So as we've talked about, and as we'll continue to talk about through this presentation, we'll see the Greeks' big focus on figuring out what proportions they think are perfect. A lot of people tended to gravitate towards this idea of 7 heads high, but of course, not all artists conform to the 7 heads high standards. An example is shown here, and this is the scraper or Apoxyomenos by Lysippus that we saw a little bit earlier in the presentation. So this was created in 4th century BCE, about 100 years after Doryphorus was created. And seeing this image here, we can see that Lysippus and his Scraper, he's added an eighth head's worth of height to his sculpture, making it look much longer, especially in the legs to me when I look at it. Now, of course, one could argue that all people are different shapes and sizes, meaning that all sculptures can be all shapes and sizes too, right? But a person who's 8 heads high is bordering on extremely tall. Even in drawing classes today, students are advised to keep figures under 7.5 heads in length to prevent their figures from becoming unrealistically lanky. But even though Lysippus didn't follow the 7-head high standard of the time, we can see that this piece is still quite beautiful. And other people of the time thought so as well. Lysippus created quite the name for himself as a sculptor during his time, and was even the court sculptor of Alexander the Great. So this is kind of a really great example of how stepping outside of the boundaries and creating your own rules, your own standards, can potentially bring a lot more success than just drawing within the lines. So looking back at just the scraper now, besides being a bit longer, as we'd talked about, what else is going on? Well, first off, just like Doryphorus, Apoxyomenos here was originally created by the Greeks and cast in bronze, and we're looking at a marble copy here. So that means that the support structures like the tree trunk attached to the left leg and the rectangular shapes coming out of his right leg and left arm we see on this marble copy would not have been present in the bronze original. Again, because the tensile strength of bronze allows the sculpture to hold itself up without these additional supports. Now, let's look again. Apoxyomenos, otherwise known as the scraper, what is he doing? Scraping his body, question mark? And the answer is yes. This was part of common hygiene practice in ancient Greece. And if there's anything, any sort of fun fact you should take away about the ancient Greeks, is that they made bathing a huge priority in their lives. So this piece was originally placed in the baths of Agrippa, which would have been in present-day Italy. And just kind of a fun fact is that the original Apoxyomenos, while it was originally placed in the baths of Agrippa, it was actually moved from the baths to Emperor Tiberius's bedroom per his request for a very short time before the public got really upset and it had to be put back. Just a little fun fact there. But anyways, here we're seeing a recreation image of an aerial view of the baths and gardens of Agrippa, where the original Apoxyomenos would have been placed. Now the area I've circled in red would have been the main bathing area and would have looked something like this up close. Now typically these baths were public places. Taking a community bath might sound weird and outlandish to us today, but nudity in ancient Greece was much more accepted and much more common than it is in our modern day world. Also in ancient Greece, people would typically exercise nude at gymnasiums too. So again, nudity was quite a normal thing at the time. So this piece was placed in a public bathhouse, but where does the idea of scraping come into play? So Greek baths were not only different from our present-day idea of baths in the sense that they were in a community space, but they were also different because the Greeks didn't bathe with soap and water how we did. They instead used oil. So bathers would go to these baths with a friend or maybe a servant. If you were more well-to-do, they would get in the bath, pour water over themselves and over each other, and then they would go out of the bath and go to an area or a room where they would put oil on themselves and on each other, and then scrape it off with a strigil, which is the tool we see here. The oil was used because it kind of clung to the dirt and grime that was on the body and then scraped away very nicely when using this strigil. And then, of course, the oil also helped to moisturize the skin too. So, The way Lysippus composed this act of scraping was kind of quite innovative compositionally for its time. Up until around this time, sculptures were very frontal, or very much so only to be viewed from one side, even though they were a three-dimensional sculpture. So looking at Doryphorus here, we see that, yes, like I said, as you can see, it is a three-dimensional form, a three-dimensional sculpture, but you can gather pretty much all the information there is to gather about the piece just by viewing it from the front. I've even given us a side view here showing that he is just pretty much very flat. You can look at him just from one side and gather the whole picture. With Apoxyomenos, however, he's still in contrapposto, like we saw with Doryphorus. He's still very muscular and idealized, but we see this new compositional forms start coming out into place. We're seeing the figure reaching out into space, truly breaking this two-dimensional boundary and reaching out into the three-dimensional world. And this really invites viewers to get interested and to walk around the piece so that they can see all these angles of it and to really understand it. It's inviting viewers to interact with it in order to fully understand this piece. This is a truly three-dimensional sculpture. So many pieces in classical Greek art were images of athletes. We see here someone throwing a discus. We have our boy Doryphorus, the spear bearer. And we have Zeus, or some believe it's Poseidon, throwing a spear in the rightmost image as well. So these are all athletes. So Apoxyomenos stands out because he is a scraper. He's bathing. He's not exercising. But many art historians believe that he's still an athlete. He's just washing up after a sweaty day at the gymnasium, a sweaty day at a sporting event, whatever. And as we talked about, we know bathing was super important to the Greeks, and this importance is embodied in this sculpture of Apoxyomenos. We even see other artists depicting athletes scraping oil from their bodies after a day of athleticism and sporting. It's incorporating two really important components of maintaining a healthy body, both exercising and then bathing and cleaning yourself as well. So we see another sculpture of a scraper here. The strigil is missing, but this sculpture would have been holding a strigil and scraping. And then we see an image of a scraper on this jar here as well. So scraping is still a huge part of athleticism, just not what we would typically associate with athletics, especially from our modern day perspectives. In conclusion, we learned Greek sculpture of the human form experienced a tremendous amount of development in the classical period through proportionality, idealism, and composition.